In several interviews, you have compared the Zionist regime to Nazism, a comparison strongly rejected by Zionists. Do you truly believe there are similarities between the two?
Well, obviously, there are similarities. There are similarities generally between any two events, as different as they might be. You can find similarities. The question is, how significant are the similarities, and are they significant enough between two discrete events, whether they're significant enough that making the analogy is intellectually or morally illuminating. I would say on many levels, obviously, there are differences between the Nazi final solution and what Israel is doing. Uh, One obvious difference is the magnitude. As you know, at some point, quantity turns into quality. So even if we take the uppermost figure, I noticed the other day Ralph Nader is claiming the um, political figure in the U.S., Ralph Nader. He's claiming 500,000 Palestinians have been killed so far. For all I know, it's true. I don't think anyone has any real handle on how many Palestinians have been killed. And then you have all the secondary questions: how many have been killed by direct targeting, how many have been killed because of malnutrition, how many have been killed because of illnesses that were preventable, except for the fact that all the doctors and hospitals were destroyed. So those calculations will take time to figure out. But let's say we take the figure. Let's take Ralph Nader's figure of 500,000, which is 10 times the official figure of the Gaza um, health ministry. 500,000 is not yet 5 million. The numbers for the Jews killed is between 5 and 6 million. So let's say 6 million. Um, it's not yet 6 million. There's a difference of magnitude, which I would say is it's not trivial. Um, so there are obvious differences, but there are also differences which work to Israel's moral detriment. Uh, this is a real life uh, genocide unfolding before our eyes. The Nazis were aware they could not do what Israel is doing. They had to wait for a war situation, and in the fog of war, to conceal the final solution. It's not as if they broadcast it on the equivalent back then of social media, what they were doing. Uh, Israel, it's being broadcast in real time. Now, of course, they make all these sorts of excuses to pretend as if what's happening is not happening. But everyone with a barely lucid mind can see they're carrying out in broad daylight, not behind the walls of a concentration camp, uh, not with the war as a concealment device. They're carrying out in broad daylight a genocide, and the population is on the board with the genocide. Um, as the opposition leader said a few months ago, the Israeli opposition leader, he said these soldiers are killing children as a hobby. That's his words, not mine. The public opinion polls show that half Israeli Jews uh, are on board to, are literally, they were asked the question, if the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, if it enters a city, should it kill everyone in the city, down to the last person? Half of the Israeli Jews said yes. Uh, a question was put to the Israelis, are there any innocents in Gaza, or is everybody a target, a legitimate target? About 70% of Israeli Jews said there are no innocents in Gaza. Now, let's make the comparison with Nazi Germany. Number one, it's hard to say whether the results among Germans would have been as bad as that. But even if they were, there's a very big difference, or there is technically a very big difference. Nazi Germany was a totalitarian state. During the war, the German people were being bombarded day in and day out, bombarded with the allegation that the war was caused by a Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy. The Jews and the Bolsheviks, the Judeo-Bolsheviks, were trying to destroy Germany. And that's what the Germans heard over and over again in a totalitarian state with no dissent. So when the German soldiers are dropping like flies in the Russian winter and they're starving to death and freezing to death, in the minds of most Germans, it's the Jews and the Bolsheviks, the Judeo Bolsheviks, that are doing this. So it's quite possible. There's all sorts of scholarship on the subject. I don't think anything definitive has been found, for the simple reason that if it's a totalitarian state, it's difficult to find results of what Germans were thinking or why they were thinking what they were thinking. Um, but in the case of Israel, it's not a totalitarian state. They have the highest usage of the internet per capita of any country in the world. Their soldiers are posting on the websites what they're doing. Everybody knows exactly what's going on. They're not victims of a totalitarian state. They are, to use an old expression, they are willing executioners of the Israeli genocide. So that particular comparison in the attempted analogy, that particular comparison works against Israel. It makes it worse than what happened under the Nazis at that level of the comparison.
Israel has become a racist colonial outpost. Was Zionism inherently racist and supremacist from the outset, or did it evolve in that direction over time?
Every nationalist ideology has a latent, every nationalist ideology has a latent supremacist um, component. The nationalism, it frequently talks about being not just, I'm not talking just about Jewish nationalism. It has a component that speaks to the superiority of that particular group of people, the fact that they were chosen in some respect. It's very hard to find, especially in the Eastern European nationalisms, a Polish nationalism or Central European, a German nationalism. They all had a what you might call a chauvinistic component to it. And there's no question that there was, because in order to achieve its goal, they needed a justifying analogy, a justifying ideology to ethnically cleanse the land, that there was a brutal rationalizing component to Zionism, as there was to American nationalism. The extermination of the native population in the US was a very ugly business, and it embraced virtually all, even decent thinkers, politicians, public figures of the era when the ethnic cleansing of the West was going on. So there's no question that just as the Americans have a very ugly history when it comes to Native Americans, I mean, it's kind of shocking even to a person who has read a lot of history, even to the history is very ugly. So there's that element in Israel. Israel's about 80 years old. That would make the United States from 1776, roughly 1850. 1850, the extermination of the native population was still going on. 1850 was before the American Civil War, so slavery was still intact in the US. So, from that point of view, Israel after 80 years is about as ugly as the US after 80 years. Uh, I would say, you know, I don't want to make any more comparisons. I just think it's very hard to compare um, the situations, except to say, in my opinion, there are significant similarities between the US in its, let's say, after 80 years, by 1850, and Israel today. And there are significant similarities and also differences which work to Israel's detriment in the case of Nazi Germany versus Israel.